Hi everyone, and welcome to my talk for Experimentation. Thank you very much for tuning in. The science of business, what do I mean by that? Well, if you work in CRO, conversion optimization, experimentation, as I'm sure everybody here does, you'll be very familiar with the challenge of getting buy-in from senior people and persuading organizations to try and invest in experimentation and increase the rate at which they do that. It's a very, very common challenge. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I actually think that a lot of the time the way we sell what we do is wrong. And it comes down to the fact that what you end up talking about a lot of the time are things like A/B testing or even experimentation. And actually these are all just tools, they're all just things that are parts of a whole that very few people seem to really properly think about or talk about. And for me, what we're ultimately trying to do when we do these things is replicate the scientific method in a business context. So the scientific method exists to remove bias and opinion from an equation of big questions and big challenges that have been trying to be solved, and to use experimentation and all sorts of different types of data to solve those problems. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. But when we go around talking to people about experimentation or A/B testing and tools and things like that, it's a little bit like scientists explaining what they do by talking about telescopes or microscopes or things like that. They're the tools that they use, but it's not the overarching thing that we're trying to do. So I just wanted to use this opportunity to take a big step back and try and see the wood for the trees, as it were, and to look at like what is it that we're trying to do? What is the scientific method, and how do we replicate that in business? And are there ways that we can, by looking at that, change what we do and change the way we talk about what we do? So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the scientific method itself in a science context, and how that works and why it works, and then try and bring that back to the business context to understand why doesn't that work in business, or where it does work, why does it work, and what therefore can we do, and how should we be talking about what we do slightly differently. So first of all, the scientific method. This is the coat of arms of the Royal Society. The Royal Society is a fellowship of scientists and academics formed at Gresham College in the UK in 1660. It's a very long time ago. And it was formed by a group of scientists wanting to share knowledge, share experiences and share learning. The fellowship has seen some of the most famous scientists and the most famous scientific experiments and been involved in everything pretty much famous that you can think of. But it's this that I want to draw your attention to. This is the motto of the Royal Society, nullius in verba. It's Latin and it means take nobody's word for it. And this was the founding motto that the fellowship came up with as they formed the society. And it encapsulates perfectly the spirit of the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment. Because what they were doing when they sat down and came up with this motto was committing to methods and ways of working and ways of doing science that resist dogma and authority. That at the time predominantly would have been the authority and dogma of the Catholic Church or other institutions such as that, who had a lot of sway in academic and intellectual subjects. And so it's really interesting because that really is the spirit, and I'm sure everybody's listening to this thinking, yeah, this resonates, because that's the spirit of what we're trying to do. We're trying to resist the authority of opinion and dogma that exists in businesses. And so there's a lot of parallels. Really, really good example of the importance of this from a storytelling point of view is the practice of bloodletting. And this just shows how difficult it is to resist dogma and how important it is. So bloodletting is the practice of basically cutting people open and letting blood flow out. It is thousands and thousands of years old. It originated in ancient Greece and was developed as a practice by a physician called Galen in Roman times. And it has been considered to be one of the best forms of curing disease for thousands of years. Now, it's actually quackery. Today, the vast majority of the medical profession in all of the world would not give this any kind of respect. And you will have heard of doctors in the Middle Ages using leeches to draw blood from people. Without going into a huge amount of detail, the piece of evidence that gave rise to the practice was a theory about the human body that Galen had, which was to do with different types of liquids in the body, and that disease were really about imbalance of these different types of liquid, the predominant one being an overabundance of blood, and therefore you have to get rid of the blood. Now, we now know today that this is simply not true, but the interesting fact about this is that this has only really been abolished in civilized Western societies for around 100 years. It carried on up until then. And around the time of the Fellowship of the Royal Society joining that I'm talking about, there was quite a lot of experimentation done by some very eminent physicians and scientists that effectively proved that this wasn't true, and they came up with new, better models of the human body and the circulation of blood. But even so, and even those particular scientists themselves did not give up the practice of bloodletting and did not advocate stopping bloodletting. And the reason being is that it was such there were such strong opinions about it being the right thing to do, specifically because it had come from a very well-respected ancient source. And as medieval times turned into the Enlightenment and scholars and other people rediscovered texts of ancient literature, what happened was that if you wanted to be seen as a respected scholar, a respected scientist of any sort, then you would want to talk about ancient texts, and it was a very sort of exclusive thing to have access to ancient Latin texts. So all of this gave rise to a huge amount of opinion about this being right, which was very, very difficult to get over. And it took a very long time for that to happen, because it's the status quo. People just simply believe it's the right thing to do. But of course it isn't, and those opinions are wrong. But looking at the scientific method as a whole, if you think about it, what great thing has ever really happened without the scientific method? So all of our advances of technology and medicine and advances in civilization since the 1660s, when that society was formed, have all been down to the scientific method. You think about space travel, about medicine, about any of these kind of great things that have happened, they have happened as a result of a methodical process of a scientific method. And particularly space travel, we didn't get to the moon by someone having an opinion that that was a cool thing to do and how to do it. We got to the moon by very, very careful experimentation and, very importantly, failure. So, trying things, failing, learning from them, trying again. The same with aviation. You've seen the videos of people again and again and again trying to create flight with different types of machines and modifying them and iterating until eventually it worked. And that is the scientific method. That's what it's about. It's about constant iteration and failure. So at the end of the day, what we have to look at is, and what's quite interesting is, if everything great that's ever happened has been as a result of this scientific method, not because of people's opinions, but as the result of a process, then why do we not do that in business? Why does nobody do that in business? So thinking about why it actually works and what it is about it that works, so that we can then look at the business world. There are several things. So first of all, what is the method itself? So, actually science disagrees that there is such a thing as a scientific method or a standard method that you can apply to everything. But for the sake of it, we'll use a kind of a fairly classic model. So first of all, you're identifying a problem. I want to get to the moon. I want to cure cancer, whatever. These are big, big problems that we're trying to solve. How to reverse global warming, this kind of stuff. And so you have that, you start off with that big problem, and then you're going to observe phenomena. That's analysis and research. And, in the case of a disease, you want to know how that presents in people who have it, and everything you can learn about it in terms of what's going on with the body and what's presenting. You then are coming up with hypotheses via induction or conjecture. Induction simply means a logical process of going from a few cases to a generalization. So for example, if I was to notice that I've seen 3 rivers and they all flow towards the sea, I might say my hypothesis is that all rivers flow towards the sea because the ones I've seen, the cases I've seen do that. And conjecture is much more of a kind of a more random idea. And then you're testing those hypotheses either through an actual experiment or can also be data analysis if the data exists, and then accepting or rejecting the hypotheses. And then the last part is really the very important part, which often, we'll come back to this, but often really gets forgotten. Analysing the data from the back of it and refinement or iteration. So we've got this big problem at the beginning. We've got this big problem of getting to the moon or something like that. And the experiment that we're running, the hypothesis that we've got, is a part of that. And so we have to review what does that tell us about this bigger goal that we've got? What does that say, and how does it fit into this overall objective that we've got? And if it didn't work, why not? And what do we do next? So there's some fundamental things about the scientific method that we want to try and replicate and that we want to try and understand in terms of how to bring that into a business context. And the number one reason it works is because it's about a process and a method as opposed to somebody's expertise. Scientists are respected for their ability to follow a process and a method rather than their past experience per se, although that does happen. But the process and method is what makes it successful. And the second part is that the reason that works is because what it's doing is uncovering the way that the world really works instead of the way we think it works. So if we run an experiment, then we see how the world is going to respond to something binary instead of just having an opinion about the way it will work. And we're trying to understand exactly how physical laws work and things like that. And the fourth is that we've got this idea of it being focused on really big goals. All science is really aiming for quite big, significant things like reversing climate change or whatever. So, and individual experiments are a part of a bigger whole and a bigger goal, and don't necessarily have value in and of themselves other than how they contribute to that goal. And the final part is that it's very much about failure and learning. Like, an experiment in and of itself is meaningless other than the information that it gives in order to achieve something bigger. And there's a part of a program of work and a program of work that's aiming towards a goal. So these are some of the things that when you think about science in a business context particularly, are we really matching those? So the last thing I wanted to do is just think about business and think about how you might use some of this information to talk about what we do in a slightly better way and to actually change how we work. So, first of all, going back to that idea, nullius in verba. Now, everybody knows about the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. And it's simply the biggest challenge in a lot of organizations trying to do experimentation. Businesses run on opinion. And so, first of all, you've got to think, how do you kind of change that culture? How do you change the fact that people want to make decisions based on their own opinion? It's very, very hard. But I personally think that this kind of storytelling and this kind of motivation to get people to try and sort of understand that really where we're aiming at is rational scientific decision making around very sort of big ideas, big strategic changes, resonates far better than going, give me some money for an A/B testing tool, or we want to do more experimentation. It doesn't really say why you're doing what you're doing. And the other really interesting thing is that actually a lot of it comes down to the way businesses run. Businesses are hierarchical organizations, and the way people are hired and remunerated, you could call something like an opinion economy. Because when businesses hire people, they hire them based on their past experience. You were at this other company, you did this. And that's impressive, so we're going to pay you a lot of money. So when people start in organizations and are in these hierarchical structures, in order to get anywhere, in order to increase, in order to protect their position, they have to demonstrate their ideas and opinions, because that is ultimately how they're valued. They're paid for their expertise and opinion. And that is ultimately what gives rise to the problem that we have. So again, it's a huge problem to solve, but we have to start thinking about the structure of organizations and the fundamental culture of organizations and how that supports what I'm talking about. I think there's a few things out of this that they're big things to tackle. But if we're gonna really sort of transform what we do into a serious function within business, and ultimately, my vision is that that a scientific process supports a hell of a lot of how business runs, not just the front end of a website or whatever. But to get there, the first thing is really, and I know it's difficult, but we have to kind of change culture. And I think what I'm trying to say here is that by trying to talk to people about the fact that science has achieved so much, and technology and things like that have achieved so much through this method, why the hell wouldn't you try and replicate that in business? Why wouldn't you try and have the same sorts of achievements? And that's a better story than a lot of the way we try and talk about experimentation at the moment. The second part is having really good articulation of business problems. And I think that means having much more of a sort of a strategic planning arm to what experimentation is about. So, mostly an experimentation program starts out going, well, let's improve conversion rate, and off they go. But, that's a financial metric of the business, but there are really, really big questions that businesses have. What if we completely got rid of this entire product line? What if we launched into international markets? What would happen if we completely went into this whole new sector of the market? Those kind of things. Those are really big questions, and by not starting out with some of these really big things, you will limit how interesting that could ever be to the senior people in a business. So I think there's a kind of a planning and strategy angle missing. And so ultimately that leads on to the third part is, having really big strategic hypotheses. That example that I gave, what happens if we launch into international markets? Not an easy thing to test, but, neither is solving cancer. So, these are the things that you have to try and think, what's our approach to doing this from a scientific point of view? And then finally, we have to shift what we do to being about learning and development and innovation. Because at the moment, everybody talks about ROI from winning tests, and, it's completely gives the wrong perception of what we do. There's been a lot of stuff about this recently, and it's a really interesting area, but we'll never get out of being seen as a tactic and almost like a marketing channel if we can't stop talking about the ROI of annualized winning tests and things like that. So yeah, that's it. I mean, in summary, let's take what we do and take it to a new level of maturity and seriousness, however we do it. But this, to me, is a potential way forward.